What's up, guys? I'm here with Chapter 3 of Book 3 of the Royal Ranger series, Duel at Araluen. Let's go ahead and get into it. The Scanians had stripped the damaged wolf ship until she was no more than an empty shell lying on the coarse sand of the beach, where her crew had beached her some days prior. Weapons, shields, bedding, and stores were all stacked well above the high water mark. For the past hour, the crew had been busy removing the deck planking and setting it to one side. The mast, yardarm, sails, and rigging formed another well-ordered pile. By now, the ship would weigh no more than half her original weight. Hal Mickelson stood with his hands on his hips, looking at the stripped hull. "All right," he said. "Let's haul her up to a more level spot." The wolf-biter currently lay at the water's edge. Her crew took hold of ropes attached to the bow post and to purchase points along the hull. Hal's crew moved to the stern to add their weight to the effort of moving the ship. "Ready?" Hal called, and receiving no sign that they weren't, added, 1, 2, 3, heave! The ropes came taut as the men threw their weight on them, their heels digging into the sand. For a moment, the ship resisted their efforts. Then she slowly began to slide up the beach. "Put your back into it, Ingvar," Hal ordered. The huge warrior gritted his teeth and bent almost parallel to the ground as he shoved with all his might. The ship began to slide more readily with his additional effort, moving with increasing freedom up the slight slope that led from the water's edge until she was on level ground. Hal held up a hand. "All right, that'll do," he called. The two crews relaxed, letting the ropes fall to the ground at their feet and the ship heel over to one side. Jern Ice Runner, the ship's skirl, dusted off his hands and walked to stand beside Hal. "You picked a good spot to beach her," Hal told him, glancing around the narrow cove, whose tall headlands protected the beach and the bay from the worst of the wind. Jern shrugged. "Luck more than judgment," he said. "I could feel the hull flexing after we hit that rock, and I just wanted to get her ashore as quickly as I could." Hal grinned. "Sometimes luck's better than judgment anyway," he said. Then he moved toward the ship. "Let's get those props under her and get her level." Earlier in the day, he had supervised the men in cutting and trimming stout props from the trees that grew around the narrow inlet. Now he directed them as they pushed on the port gunwale to bring the ship upright, then placed 4 of the props under her to keep her there. Some of the crew took 4 more props and placed them on the opposite side to prevent the ship tipping the other way. Hal studied the props closely, making sure they were well seated and the sand under them was compacted and firm. He shoved hard against the hull, trying to tilt it one way or the other, but it remained solid. Stig, Hal's best friend and first mate, stood watching, a concerned look on his face. He knew what was coming next. He gestured to Ingvar, the largest man in the 2 crews, to come closer. "Just stand by in case we're needed," he said. Ingvar nodded, understanding. Hal dropped to his hands and knees, peering under the propped-up hull. He raised one hand and ran it along the smooth planks, testing, pushing. The planks felt solid under his exploring hand. Then he crouched lower and scrambled in until he was well under the ship, feeling the weed and barnacle-encrusted timbers a few centimeters above him. He took a small timber maul from his belt and hammered it against the hull at different points. Stig and Ingvar took an involuntary pace forward as he did so, watching for any sign that the ship might move or that the props might be dislodged with the impact of his blows. Jern was watching anxiously as well, although his concern was more for his ship and what Hal might discover than for Hal's well-being or safety. He knew Hal was an experienced shipwright, and he'd done this sort of thing before. Hal scuttled farther aft, duck-walking on his heels. He stopped at a point about a third of the way down the ship's length. "Jern, is this where you struck the rock?" he called. He prodded experimentally at the hole. Jern screwed up his face as he considered the question. Pretty much, Hal, as far as I could tell. Hal said thoughtfully. He hammered again on the hole. This time, the sound was slightly different. It sounded duller, somehow. Hal hit the planks twice more, swinging them all awkwardly in the cramped space. Ingvar had his hands resting lightly on the side of the hole, and he felt the vibration of the blows. Wish he wouldn't do that, he muttered, glancing at the nearest prop. He knows what he's doing, Stig replied, although it sounded more like a statement of hope than reassurance. Good. Here he comes, he added. Hal scuttled out from under the beached ship. Stig stretched out a hand to help his friend stand. Hal grinned at him, dusting sand off the knees of his leggings. Mother hens, he said, including Ingvar in the statement. I know what I'm doing. He reached up and took hold of the ship's rail, hauling himself up and over it, and lowering himself into the hole. There was more hammering and banging from inside the wolf ship, the noise echoing in the empty hole. Stig and Ingvar relaxed. There was no chance now that a dislodged prop could send the ship crashing down on their skirl. Jern, however, was still concerned as he waited for the verdict. Wolfbiter was the assigned duty ship for the year, the ship provided to King Duncan of Araluen by the Scandian Oberjarl to patrol the coast, pursue pirates, smugglers, and slavers, and carry urgent messages. Some 2 weeks prior, she had come to grief in a fierce storm, being driven close inshore and hurled onto an uncharted rock. Jern had heard the sickening crunch as she made contact and felt the hull flexing badly. Fearing that the keel was broken, he had hurried to beach the ship before she broke in two. The accident happened to coincide with the arrival of Hal's ship, the Heron, at Castle Araluen. Hal was on an unrelated mission, but when word came that Wolfbiter was seriously damaged, he had hurried back to the East Coast to provide assistance. Jern counted himself extremely lucky. Hal was possibly the finest shipbuilder in Scandia. But that luck might not hold. If the ship's keel was in fact broken, Jern knew that there would be no repair. They would have to abandon her, burn her, and find their own way back to Scandia. It would also leave Araluen without a duty ship until another crew could make their way to Araluen across the storm-white sea. That would take months, and word would get around among the smugglers and slavers who infested these waters that the coast was unpatrolled. They would quickly begin their predations once more. Bad news traveled swiftly. The hammering stopped, and Hal's face appeared at the railing. With the decking removed, he had to heave himself up so he could roll over the gunwale. Jern took half a pace forward, not wanting to hear the worst. But Hal smiled at him, reassuringly. "Pretty sure the keel is sound," he said. Jern let go a breath that he had been holding for too long. Then he frowned. "But I could feel her moving and flexing as the waves passed under her." Hal nodded. "Two of the frames are badly cracked. You couldn't see them until we took up the decking and unloaded the stores. But they would have caused the movement in the hull that you could feel. Shouldn't take too long to put them right." Jern's shoulders sagged with relief. It was the sort of news he had been hoping for, although he hadn't allowed himself to hold that hope too strongly. He was superstitious, as were many sailors, and he believed that if he hoped for a good result, it wouldn't happen. "That's great news," he said. "Thanks, Hal." Hal shrugged. "I'm glad it's fixable." Stig tilted his head to one side, regarding the wounded wolf ship with a critical eye. "Can you repair her here, on the beach?" Hal shook his head. "Not properly. We'd have to strip off the planking, take her back to her basic framework skeleton, remove the cracked ribs, and shape new ones. Bit of a big task here in the open." Jern's face fell. He thought Hal had said the ship would be repaired. Hal patted him reassuringly on the shoulder. "Don't worry. We can do a perfectly good temporary repair here. One that'll get you home again. Then you can find a shipyard to do a proper job." He scratched his chin as he thought about the task ahead. "We'll mend the cracked ribs with a fish," he said. Then, seeing the confused expression on Jern's face, he explained. "We'll shape timbers to fit either side of the rib, then screw them tightly together, like a splint on a broken leg. I'll draw up a template for you so you can shape them. I suggest you do that back at the village below Castle Araluen, where there's a good carpentry shop. Then you can bring the pieces back here and screw them in place." "And that'll hold?" Jern asked. Hal nodded. "In the short term, enough to get you home again. But the longer you leave them, the more they'll work loose, and then she'll start flexing again." He glanced up at the sky. The sun was already behind the hills to the west of the beach, and there was a smell of rain in the air. "It's nearly dark. Let's roll her farther up the beach. I suggest you leave 4 or 5 men here to keep an eye on her. I'll ferry the rest of you back to Castle Araluen tomorrow." As the tide started to come in the following morning, the 24 sailors from Wolfbiter who were accompanying the herons back to Castle Araluen picked up their weapons, shields, and sea bags, and trooped down the beach to where Heron was drawn up on the edge of the water. Heron was a much smaller ship than Wolfbiter, and there was a few minutes' confusion as they clambered aboard and found space to stow their gear. Then they settled in among themselves along the center of the deck as Stig and Ingvar shoved the ship off the beach and into the water. There was the usual clatter of wood on wood as the Heron's crew unstowed their oars and ran them out through the rowlocks. Then they backed water, and the neat little ship slid away from the beach into deeper water. Hal threaded his way through the crowd of men sprawled on the deck and took the tiller. He nodded to Stig, who was on the stern oar, and the tall sailor called orders to the rowers. "Back port! Ahead starboard!" Under the opposed thrust of the 2 sets of oars, the ship pivoted neatly in her own length, until her sharp prow was pointing out to the sea. "Ahead together! Pull! Pull! Pull!" Stig ordered, setting the pace for the rowers. Jern moved to stand beside Hal at the steering platform. He watched appreciatively as the little ship gathered way, the sides of the cove slipping past them with increasing speed. "She handles nicely," he commented. Hal smiled at the compliment. "Thanks, we like her," he said. He glanced up at the wind telltale on the mast. It streamed out to starboard. That meant that when they reached the mouth of the cove and turned north, the wind would be dead ahead. Jern noticed the look. In fact, he had just checked the telltale himself. It was an automatic reaction for any skirl. "Looks like we'll be rowing," he said. Hal had come to the same conclusion. Heron, with her fore and aft sail plan, could tack across the headwind like this, making ground in a series of diagonal runs. But that would mean a lot of sail handling, which would be difficult when the decks were crowded with the extra numbers. On the other hand, those extra numbers meant they had plenty of men ready to take a turn at the oars. On the whole, Hal decided, they'd make better time if they rowed north to the mouth of the Seamath. "My boys will take a turn at the oars if you want," Jern offered. Hal nodded his gratitude. "We'll get her clear of the bay first." He took her a kilometer off the coast to give himself plenty of sea room. At the moment, the wind was from the north, but that could change without warning, and they could find themselves on a lee shore, with the wind setting them back against the land. All skirls were wary of such a thing happening, and it was normal practice to keep the coastline in sight, but leave plenty of maneuvering room in case of trouble. Hal nodded at Jern. Wolfbiter's skirl took a few paces forward and raised his voice to call to his crew. "All right, boys, why don't 16 of you take over from the herons and show them how real sailors row?" After several seconds of sorting out who would row, his men clambered down into the rowing well and replaced the herons at the oars. With 8 men aside, they had 2 men pulling each one. Jern's first mate, Sten Ingolson, took Stig's place at the rearmost oar and called the stroke to get his men rowing in time. Under the increased thrust of the double-banked oars, Heron fairly shot ahead, cutting through the water so that a sizable bow wave sprang up and a white wake began to unfurl behind her. Jesper, who had been manning one of the forward oars, came aft and sprawled comfortably on the deck beside Hal's position at the tiller. "This is the life," he said. "Can we keep them?" One of the rowers overheard him and grinned up from his bench. "She's a lightweight," he said, heaving on his oars with no apparent effort. "We could keep this up all day." "Is that so?" Stan called from his bench. "In that case, let's up the pace a little. Pull! Pull! Pull!" As the rowers pulled faster and time to his increased rate, Heron gathered even more speed. There was a long, smooth swell coming from the north. Driven before the wind, the ship swooped over the waves, her bow smashing through the tops, sending spray cascading back over the ship and the men seated on her center decking. Nobody cared. They were sailors, and they were used to being wet. The exhilarating speed of the ship's passage more than made up for the minor discomfort of a little water landing on them. Stig came to join the two skirls at the steering platform. "I'm with Jesper," he said. "Let's take these people along on all of our cruises. We'll never have to raise the sail." "Your men can certainly handle the oars," Hal said to Jern. The older skirl nodded. "They're a good crew, but as Lars said, this ship is a real lightweight. They're used to hauling Wolfbiter around, and she weighs 3 or 4 times as much as this little beauty." "Well, my men certainly appreciate the rest," Hal told him, nodding to where Ulf and Wolf, the identical twin sail trimmers, were calling good-natured jibes at the rowing crew. In fact, all of the Heron's crew were enjoying the novelty of being rowed rather than rowing themselves, and they enjoyed the exhilaration of feeling that ship moving so fast. She had never cut through the water like this under oars before. They powered on up the coast, which lay off their port side like a long gray-green line. True to the oarsman's word, the Wolfbiter crew maintained their cracking pace without any sign of flagging. Long before Hal had originally expected to see it, the mouth of the river Seamath opened up on the coast to port. He heaved on the tiller and swung the ship's head through 90 degrees, heading for the broad river. The swell and wind had been in their teeth up till this point. Now they were coming for almost dead abeam, and the pitching, swooping motion of the ship changed. She began to roll heavily, sometimes dipping her lee-side gunwales under water. Hal eyed the river ahead with narrowed eyes. He had originally set Heron's course for the center of the river, but although she was still pointing in that direction, he could see her head was falling off downwind, her line of travel taking her toward the southern bank. Jern hesitated, not sure if he should call Hal's attention to it. It would be the height of bad manners to advise another skirl without being asked. He relaxed when he saw Hal shove the tiller over, so that the bow angled toward the northern bank. Now the rudder and the oars were pushing her up to the north, and the wind setting her down to the south. After a few minor adjustments to the tiller, the two forces balanced, and she held a true course down the center of the river. Hal had seen Jern's momentary indecision. He smiled at him now. "I had noticed," he said. The rolling motion lessened as they ran in under the shelter of the headlands, and the waves died down. There was still plenty of wind, however, and once they had traveled a few 100 meters inland, Hal made a sign to Jern. "Oars up," the older man ordered, and the 8 oars rose, dripping from the water, held parallel to the surface. "Oars in." They slid inboard with a rattle of wood on wood. The ship continued to move forward, the way gradually dying off her. "Sail handlers," Hal called, "take your stations." Ulf and Wolf had been waiting for the order. They sprang to their feet and scuttled forward, avoiding the butts of the oars as they were hauled inboard. "Stow oars," Jern ordered, and there was more clattering as the 8 white oak shafts were raised and then placed into the fork-shaped oar rests that held them running fore and aft down the center line of the ship. At the same time, Ingvar, Jesper, and Stefan followed the twins forward and took up their position by the halyards on the starboard side. "Port sail up," Hal ordered, and the 3 crewmen heaved on the halyard, sending the port side yardarm and sail sliding up the stumpy mast until it clunked into position in the socket that held it in place. As the wind caught it, the sail bellied out for a second or two. Then Ulf and Wolf hauled on the sheets to bring the sail tight. It hardened into a smooth curve, trapping the brisk wind from the north. They heaved in harder, and Heron accelerated forward. For a moment or two, her lee side gunwale dipped close to the river surface. Then Ulf and Wolf eased the sheets slightly, just before Hal could call out the necessary order. The ship stood more upright, and the water gurgled and chuckled along her side. Within a few minutes, the white wake was streaming out behind her in a straight line. She had settled on her course, and was moving every bit as swiftly as she had under the thrust of the Wolfbiter crew's brawny arms. Jern nodded in appreciation. "Like I said, she's a sweet little craft." Hal glanced at the banks slipping past them, estimating their speed. "At this rate, we'll be at Castle Araluen in another 3 hours," he said. All right, that's going to be the end of Chapter 3. Thank you all for listening, and I will see you next time in Chapter 4. God bless, and have a good one.